welcome to another Altogether Now Shorncliffe podcast. This episode is all about guys running around the field, playing with an odd-shaped ball with the great name of rugby. Rugby is one of my passions. Rugby is the greatest game in the world. And we're very lucky tonight to have in a podcast, apart from my usual, James O'Brien, say hello.
Good evening.
Steve Head, say hello.
Good evening.
We've also got tonight, we've got a fantastic author with us, Stephen Cooper, who wrote, well, I found out about him through a great book he wrote called The Final Whistle. How you doing, Stephen?
I'm good. Thank you for having me on.
Well, what can I say about John Dennison? John Dennison, are you still an RFU referee?
No. I packed in January 15. I was pensioned off.
John is the brains behind the Rugby Memorial in France. Again, we'll talk about more of that in this podcast. But this is what we want to talk about. Obviously, the Six Nations have just started. I remember the first time I ever saw rugby ball. And I remember the headmaster coming out, bringing the odd-shaped ball, saying, today, you guys, we're going to be playing rugby. And I must have been about 4 or 5 at the time. So, John, you played.
Yeah, started in my home village at East Peckham in Kent in 1977 when I was 18. Know anything about rugby? They stuck me on the wing, the first ever game for the club. And my training session was run forwards and pass backwards.
So, Stephen, I presume you must have played.
I played. I didn't have what you call a career. I just played till I was 26 and realised I was rubbish. I had a brief moment when I went to New York in my early 30s, and they had a team in New York called Manhattan. They didn't play on Manhattan because there's nowhere to play. They played over on Long Island, and they had just the coolest stash. The shorts had this little skyline in Manhattan. I had to have the stash. I spent 2 whole weeks searching for a pair of rugby boots in the whole of New York. They were not to be found. All you could get was sort of plastic soccer boots. I got those anyway. Turned up for the first training session, and I'm 6'3", relatively large, and I arrived, and I just looked up and thought, oh my word, because all these guys are gridiron players fed on red meat, and they were twice the size. And at this point, I just got married, and my wife was very keen on our marital prospects at that point. She said, no, you're not going to do that. So after one training session, I retired again.
Actually crazy. So, so we're really here to talk about rugby and its link to the military. I mean, when I was at school, we were used to play RMS Dover, which was a military school down in Dover, and they were, my God, every time we played them, it was a battering one way or another. You knew you were going to have to play them. That was from the ages of, from ages of 13 to 18. Tough kids, really tough kids. The rugby has literally is really important. Now, in World War I, was it the same? I know in football, the footballers would seem to be very late coming to the party, so to speak. Was that the same for rugby players?
No, I mean, rugby, the difference is, and football is much reviled because of this. Now, I suppose I probably contributed to that process, but the difference was between an amateur game, of gentlemen, and a professional game, because football by that point was a professional game. And when war was declared, you've got to be aware that most of the country is being assured that the war would be over by Christmas. So professional players playing for professional clubs who need to keep the turnstiles turning saw no reason to break legal contracts. These were legal employment contracts and go off to war when the war would be over by Christmas. Now, we all know the war wasn't over by Christmas. And at that point, football began to be very unpopular. And there were a lot of demonstrations and a lot of, propaganda posters, scorning and shaming footballers. And the vicars were preaching from pulpits about, how footballers, were not doing their bit for the country. Difference with rugby, it was an amateur game. There was no professionalism at all. So they were free to go. They had to obviously leave their jobs, but they did so. One of the things I found with Rosslyn Park, for instance, that by September, the first week of September, a huge number of those in my books had already volunteered or were already in the military in some way or another, Army, Navy. And this is because they were very enthusiastic about it. That many of them had served with the territorial regiments, which were set up in 1908. So we're already doing military service. And it was a simple matter of saying, okay, I'm now willing to serve overseas, which is not what the territorials were set up to do. They actually had to sign a new piece of paper because territorials were about home defence. They had to sign a new piece of paper that said, yes, I will go overseas. And off they went. So, that was an easy one. When I think it's the 4th of September, the rugby union put out an announcement that basically says we're going to not play this season because of the present demands of war. But by this point, there were no clubs anyway because they'd all closed down because all their players had already signed up. So it was a fait accompli. And the RFU, one might also say, was slightly after the event. They just simply missed the boat. All the players already volunteered. They're already in training. And some of them were actually already over in France as well. So, rugby very quick, football very slow. Not really their fault, professional game. But they carried on the football season until April of 1915. And there's a really good pub trivia question here, which is the team that won the league that year was Everton, and because there was no more football for another 4 years, Everton remained champions of English football for 4 years.
I can see John's pleased about that.
I'm a Toffee supporter.
There you go.
Ironically, actually, women's football became extremely popular during that period as well, didn't it?
Yeah, which is again, we look at the sport and people who follow football and rugby nowadays. There's always that legacy of the interwar years. Was it the same in World War II?
No, I mean, the World War II is a very different conflict. It wasn't the same mass joining up as there was in 1914. And society, almost as a result of the First World War, had changed. It was no longer a simple. I mean, there was still trace of the whole public school caste system, but it had changed. I think by that point, the distinctions were almost, they were just not there. I mean, again, rugby players still flocked to the colours, and that's sort of where my story started, because Rosslyn Park and its clubhouse had this World War II memorial to those who fought, and it's a very rare use of the phrase in the Second Great War. I don't think I've ever seen that phrase used before, the Second Great War. Now, that rather implied what I later found out from an elderly member of the club who's since passed, is that there was actually a big memorial plaque to those who died in the First Great War. But it had been lost when the club moved in 1956 from Old Deer Park in Richmond, or by Kew, by the pagoda there, over to where it is now on the South Circular. This chap swore blind. He put this wooden support onto the removal van. He wasn't at the other side when they were offloading it, and he never saw it again. It's a mystery as to what on earth happened to that war memorial. But having found out that story, I thought, well, do we know how many died and who they were? And the fact was we didn't. The only clue is a tiny little press clipping in one of the scrapbooks that were kept in the archives of the club, which literally said 72 died. I think the headline was a magnificent record. 72 died, 63 military crosses, 2 Victoria Crosses, the whole catalogue of decorations and medals. Not a single name was mentioned. So these guys had just become statistics already, by a club that presumably knew them as friends. They're called Bill and Charlie and things like that. But already they'd become anonymous. There were just so many stats in a war that was full of stats. And I thought, well, it's awful that these 72 blokes have been forgotten, and they don't deserve to be. So I set about the process of trying to find who they were. And thankfully, the club had actually kept its records in the safe, and they hadn't been burnt as for instance, London Scottish. All their records got accidentally burned. And when they did their First World War stuff, they really had to almost start from scratch and try and work out who had been there and who'd been killed. But Rosslyn Park still had its minute books going back to 1879. So, lots of cross-tabbing of the entries in there with the Commonwealth war graves. And I say that the aiming target was 72. Now, this was just, at the time, it was just a project. I took my mighty under-13s on tour to France. And we went to Compiègne, where the armistice is signed, and we'd done a bit of a battlefield tour, which frankly the boys really didn't care about. I mean, it was stunning how uninterested they were in this whole thing. But I was trying to instill in them a sense of what had happened, but they just didn't want to know. They just wanted to play rugby, so fair enough. But at Compiègne, we played, and by the side of the pitch, they had a memorial there where I think they lost 58 of their 120 members in the First War. 55, yeah. And very appropriate. Before we played the game, it was on a Sunday, we had a service, and the French who take this stuff very seriously, as John will know, and they do it very well. Chap from the military came along dressed in the full blue rig and the KP and such like, and he gave a speech in French, and he said, the phrase that struck me most and really got me inspired and led to the book was, he said, rugby and warfare share a common language. Mais enfin, he said, ce n'est pas la même chose. At the end of the day, it's not the same thing. And this really struck me. And I started reading the press reports on rugby games and noticing how the journalists casually fell into the use of this military language. There's I think 2012, when the England team with Farrell, when he was only just started playing for them, went over to Ireland. Ireland were heavily fancied. England were a very callow, youthful team. And they came away with a very hard fought, I think it was 12-9 or something like that. So it's just a kicking game, which is England's speciality, of course. But they came back. And Mick Cleary in the Telegraph said, these are not young boys. They're hardened for the trenches, he said. He actually used the word hardened for trenches. When you think about the language, there's torpedo kicks, there's sort of bombs. Do you remember when Bill McLaren always described Gavin Hastings having a boot like a howitzer? And there's military language everywhere. Scrum halves sniping around the corner and things like that. Yeah. And I began to think, well, why is this? Why is this association? Because it actually doesn't really happen with other sports. And okay, attack and defence, you have that in sport as well, but the particular military language. And then I started noticing this affinity of rugby with the military. So if you remember Help for Heroes, when they first started, as a result of the response to the Afghan war, the first thing they did was a mass cycle ride to Paris, and frankly, nobody noticed. It was the first thing they did. Second thing they did a huge rugby game at Twickenham with, I think, Delalio captaining one side and Martin Johnson the other, and they raised £1 million, and it put them on the map. And rugby very quickly rallied to this cause of the soldiers who were being killed in Afghanistan and said, we must help. And I think that affinity carries on. So from those players I described before the First World War, who were rugby players who had already joined the military, to those who then volunteered very, very quickly in August and September of 1914, to today, the tradition still carries on. And there is almost like it's not a symbiotic relationship, and it's more of an officer class thing than the rank and file. But nonetheless, there is a very strong relationship with these two. And I mean, I sat and thought, and rubbed my beard and stroked my chin and thought, well, why is this? And I've come to a conclusion, and let's see if you guys would agree with this. But I mean, there's lots of sports that are dangerous. Plenty of those. I mean, anything involving horses and cars in particular seem to be very dangerous. And you even get, I mean, sadly, you get cricketers killed by a blow on the head. It's happened quite recently. And so, but I looked at all the sports, and decided that the difference with rugby is that unique amongst team sports, and emphasise the team, is that without the protection of padding or helmets, rugby players go out to play that game in a common cause on behalf of their team, and they put themselves in harm's way. And that's the key thing, is they put themselves in harm's way on behalf of the team in a common cause. And I can't really think of any other sport that does that in the same way as a team. Individual sports are dangerous, but other team sports aren't, frankly, and they don't put themselves in harm's way. I mean, you could say anybody facing Jofra Arch is in harm's way, but again, it's my definition. It probably doesn't stand up to close scrutiny, but that's where I felt that there's a guy you may know, James, an Australian general, Cosgrove. I think he was your senior general, Australian general. Yeah. So he actually said, probably far more eloquently than me, he said, There are similarities between the harsh and lethal demands of warfare and the thrill we get from a full-body contact sport like rugby. The thing about rugby is it does prepare people to keep going under severe stress, and things they have to do are extraordinarily hard. And that's it. That sort of sums up. If you can basically go into the type of physical contact that's involved in rugby and do it repeatedly again and again and again, it's the closest we can get to, if you like, a facsimile of what wartime experience is. That's my theory.
It's actually interesting as well, Stephen, is that taking one of your points a little bit further, is that back in 2014, when we did the first event, Le Tranchée des Rugbymen, here on the Chemini Dam, we marked the deaths of the first rugby internationals from World War I in September 1914. But David Crease from the Army Chaplains Department actually made a really good presentation to the kids we had over from Blackheath and London Scottish. And he was actually sort of saying that the structure of a rugby team you can actually equate to a military system as well. In other words, you've got the forwards, you've got your commanders at 9 and 10, you've got your fast guys out in the centres, fullbacks, wingers, etc. And it kind of reflects that you've got the leadership there in the middle, grunts, the forwards have to do the hard work, whilst basically the backs are coming in and sort of sweeping in afterwards. So there is this, everybody has a job. And so if you take it from prop hooker, second row, anchor 8, whatever, like it is in a battalion or a platoon even, everybody has a specific job. And rugby actually equates itself to that military system.
Was it? I mean, it's also interesting that all the Allies had something in common. They all played rugby.
Yeah, I mean, it was effectively an Anglo-Saxon export rugby. I mean, it was created in the UK, and then sort of, like so many games, we invented, and everybody else becomes better than us. Yeah,
so should I stay quiet here at this point?
No, not at all.
You're okay. You're not better than us.
No, not at the moment, anyway. We have been in the past, but it is interesting what you say about Australia. A quick bit of research shows that we lost 10 internationals of the war. 2 of those were killed in the opening day of the Gallipoli landings. Yeah. So, and we had 2 military cross winners as well that were killed in that 10. Now, when you compare that to the list of Australian rules, or what they called, Victorian rules football back in the day, those numbers are in the hundreds, because again, back then, Aussie rules footy, or footy as we call it, was played more, and it was more in abundance. And really, you only really found rugby in places like New South Wales and Queensland. The rest of Australia was all about Aussie rules. But the 10 that we lost, there was certainly a great deal of talent, but it doesn't count all of those who were wounded. And there's a British Isles and Aussie player, Tom Richards. He took some pretty severe wounds to his back and his shoulders, and he died through complications of tuberculosis in about 1935. But those statistics aren't counted. So you could say that we lost 10, and I'm only speaking from the Australian point of view, but we could have easily lost 100. Those statistics sadly weren't counted.
Well, in fact, from the 1913 team, you actually lost 6 players from that team that played against New Zealand, known as Bad 6.
And in fact, if you look at the New Zealand statistics, 13, officially 13 lost, but again, it could go into the hundreds, because New Zealand, as we know, our neighbours down under, are crazy about rugby. It's all they play. They live it, they breathe it, they eat it for breakfast. It's what they do. So to only lose 13, again, officially, but unofficially, it would go easily into the hundreds.
So obviously during wartime, there's obviously a lot of inter-service games played. It's hard to arrange it, but I know where the game's played, obviously the worst thing to do is if you've got the Aussie and New Zealanders next to each other, it'd be safer putting them over the top than actually playing rugby against each other. You lose less people. But were the games played during the war and in the rear?
Yeah, there's definitely games played. In fact, one of the tribute events that we ran with Sedberg School, the old Sedbergians, and we dedicated a weekend with them to Freddie Turner, as he was known as, Scotland international. and he certainly played behind the lines, as did Paul Palmer, I believe, as well, Stephen, didn't he?
Yeah, there was a famous game in 1915, sort of, where Paul Palmer was to die about sort of a couple of months later.
That's
But a whole bunch of internationals all sort of assembled and played a game. It was the most star-studded game. I mean, there is still debate today about the exact teams. There's one or two A and others, on the team sheet that nobody can quite remember who they were. But yeah, that was going on. But I mean, in the early days, when the guys were training for the military, it was deemed to be the perfect form of training. It got you fit, it taught you discipline, and it taught you teamwork. That's the thing, to take orders, to play to a game plan. So rugby was actively encouraged as something that people should do. It was also used very heavily as a recruiting tool, because again, of this association of warlike men, sort of thumping the blazes out of each other on the field. It was deemed to be a fantastic opportunity to recruit like-minded spectators who may have played a bit themselves, join the colours. So that they had Edgar Mobbs, who was the captain of Northampton Saints and also England on one occasion. He recruited his own company, D Company, the 7th Northants, who became Mobb's own. He started off as a lowly private and then worked his way up to become Lieutenant Colonel by the time he was killed in 1917. But he organised a game in January 1915 at the county ground in Northampton, which was England versus Scotland. So it was serving soldiers who were English or Scottish, many of whom were internationals. Edgar Mobbs was there, and it was a recruiting thing. The whole idea was to attract young men to this game while they were there to deliver the recruiting message. And there's a wonderful sort of little line in the programme. So Lieutenant Mobbs, because he was only a lieutenant at that point, would be pleased to welcome any volunteer to the dressing room after the game, which sounds a bit dodgy nowadays, but in those days, what he's basically saying is, rather regally, I will give you an audience. You will meet the great Edgar Mobbs. I mean, he had been captaining. He was a hero in Northampton because of captaining Saints. So he was, the biggest thing, close to a rock star at the time, and therefore to him to grant him an audience was a severe incentive. And apparently a lot of guys, just for the sake of meeting the great Edgar Mobbs, volunteered and joined the army.
It's very interesting because at the time they were having real problems because by 1917 everybody knew what was happening in the war. There wasn't any real secrets about what was happening on the Western Front too much. Casualty returns were coming in. It was a real difficulty of obtaining guys to join up. Obviously you had conscription coming in 16 as well. So it's interesting to see that it actually had a positive effect as well.
But all club rugby stopped completely. There's no club rugby at all. But some of the clubs, like Rosslyn Park, kept going. They kept the subs going. All the members sort of kept on paying the subs just so there'd be an infrastructure. And Rosslyn Park organised all these military games, where soldiers coming back from the front for a bit of leave would basically, for a bit of fun, rest and recreation, would play rugby. Or alternatively, the kids coming straight out of the sixth form at school would be hardened up for a life in the trenches by playing a few rugby games. And this is the origin of the Rosslyn Park School Sevens. I mean, they sort of basically started school board games, public schools games, in 1914, 1915. And again, it was designed to be training for young men before they went to war. And then they, as the war went on, you got guys coming back, either wounded or just for a bit of rest. They would start rehabbing. There's a New Zealand player called Crystal. It wasn't an All Black or anything like that, but his name was, I think it was Harvey Crystal. And he came back, and there's a letter from him where he says, "I shall miss the pleasant Saturday afternoon recreation. It has got me fit in wind and limb when the doctors had given me up for dead." He'd come back with basic shell shock, and the doctors had said, "Well, you're not good to go back to the front, but we prescribe manly pursuits." I mean, that was literally that was a medical prescription for shell shock at the time, manly pursuits, and it's felt that by indulging in manly pursuits, you would knock it out of yourself. And in Harvey Crystal's case, it was the truth. He played rugby and he went back to the front. He survived the war as well.
Rugby is that unique game, and it is that bond in the locker room. I've played a bit of football, but it's completely different because you have to, especially as a forward, you have to be shoulder to shoulder. I started off in the front row, then moved to flanker, but you start off as there's 3 of you locked together, then there's 5 of you locked together, and there's 8 of you locked together. And you have to, I mean, if you're looking at the bombers or the shock troops, which are basically the back row, and then you're looking at the cavalry out on the wings and the ones that can maneuver quickly, it's rugby is certainly the game. Was it the same with rugby league? See, my family, my grandfather was a rugby league player up in Salford. And was it the same for rugby league as well?
Yeah, there was a lot of league guys came in. I mean, probably one of the most famous ones is Jack Harrison, who played for Hull. VC, killed at Arras. And he again was the rugby league type recruitment guy who they think he was such a famous player within the sport.
Again, I mean, you've got to remember the social caste system at the time. You know, rugby league was a northern sort of game, which was a breakaway from rugby union, very controversial when it happened, and they were paid. It was professional, so there was a huge amount of southern snobism about it. There was one particular team in London, the Army Service Corps, which is we call it Loggies now, the Royal Logistics Corps. So they basically shifted stuff from one place to another, but they were called the Army Service Corps at the time. They had a team that did nothing but play exhibition rugby. And they had quite a lot of rugby league players in there who, the great phrase, they were called amnested. They were amnested, as if somehow what they were doing was illegal. So, but this is the rugby union being snobbish about it. They amnested them and allowed them to play rugby, despite the fact they'd gone off to what was called the Northern Union. Before it was called Rugby League, it was called the Northern Union. And they were amnested and allowed to play rugby again. So, I mean, it's so patronising, unbelievable. But there was a bit of a circus of this particular team going around playing any team that came back from the trenches. There's a very nice print from a magazine which I've got somewhere, which shows the New Zealand trenches team who came back on leave and played the Army Services Corps at what is recognisably Richmond's ground, the Richmond Athletic ground. And it's what they did. So it was like a travelling circus. And people like Edgar Mobbs, who I previously said, he was a bit scornful of these guys. He went to one of those games when he came back after being wounded in 1917 for a bit of rehab, went to a game and was very scathing about these guys, playing some rugby but not being at the front. Again, it was controversial, but there wasn't purely rugby league, but a lot of rugby league stars were in that particular Army Service Corps team.
So, John, obviously you founded the Rugby Memorial in France. Tell us about that. Tell us what inspired you to start that, why you chose the location, and basically everything. Because
well, for me, part of my personal backstory of actually tracing my grandfather. Originally came from South Africa, underage soldier, fought on the Somme, and was at Delville Wood. He was one of the survivors, but was later wounded. And my father was born in 1918, 1st of September 18. But father and son never met. My grandfather would have got a letter in the trenches to say he was a father, but that was 9 weeks before the end of the First World War, and in that time he was killed. And my father became a foundling. So that was kind of the basis of where I sort of come from. With things. So then the adopted name that my father was given in February 1919. And from there, he was a sportsman. I've been a sportsman in my time. And coming over here to Lens in the N department. So if you don't know your geography, the bit of northern France, we're one department below the Somme. That's about an hour's drive north from here. And here, of course, the Chemins-Dédain was the big battlefields. Majority of the war, of course, this patch was fought on by the French, but the Brits were here in 14, 17 and 18. And I got involved with the local rugby club, having moved over here, as you do. And we got a couple of touring teams out. My old club at Maidstone, where I used to play, with probably old fellas to come out and play a couple of games. And the club president said to me about, well, can we get some more games? And it was mid 2013. And I said, well, if we wait a season, let's actually plan something a bit special, because we can do something to mark the centenary of the First World War. And at that point, my knowledge was very low base on things. I then got introduced to a guy called Frank Viltar at the Conseil department, and Frank had been appointed to oversee all First World War centenary projects in the north of France. And he's a rugby guy as well. We got chatting, and so we came up with the first event because we realised that the first 3 internationals killed were killed on or around the Chemin-des Dames, and many others wounded. And we came up and we found that from the British side that the 3 players killed came from Blackheath and London Scottish. So we set up this project called La Tranchée de Rugby Med, in other words, the Rugby Players Trench, because it was won the early September the 14th, 1914, on an attack at a place called Cerny and Lannoy. The Germans held the ridge and the Brits had to attack up, and of course it was all part of the first offensive here on the Marne and Chemin-des Dames area. And so we did this first event, and we're a bit flat afterwards for a few months, and Frank and I met up in his office one day and we said, well, what else can we do? And the 2015 World Cup was looming large on the horizon at the time. And we've done a bit more research, found out a bit more about the history of rugby, and I used Stephen's book actually as part of my research as well, amongst many other things. And of course we had the Rugby Museum at Twickenham, which was easy access to get to know people there. And we came up with this idea of a Rugby Memorial. We weren't too sure quite what we were going to do with it, but we related it to those first internationals killed on the Chemin-des Dames. So that's why it's at Craynell, and that's the reason why. It's actually interesting people that say such a monument would look really good at Twickenham, till I pointed out that Twickenham was just used to feed horses in the First World War. And that was about it, as it was Cabbage Patch, as it was known as at the time. And we just sort of progressed forward from there. We got permission. We had some land from the Conseil department where the Basque Memorial is. The Basque Regiment lost a lot of men here in the First World War. Huge connection between this region and the southwest of France now. Huge rugby playing area, of course. Yeah. Many rugby players killed from all the famous clubs in the south because they fought here on the Chemin-des Dames. And we were given a plot of land adjacent to their monument, and we have it built. And we put a plea out at the time, sort of ideas of how we can do things, and Jean-Pierre Rive heard about it.
Jean-Pierre Rive?
Yeah, and he contacted, we were in the office at the Conseil department one morning, and this phone call came through to Frank's office, and it said, someone called Mr. Rive is on the phone, and Jean-Pierre Rive, and we looked at each other across the office going, yeah, right, as you do.
Yeah.
And he's a sculptor by trade.
No, did not know that.
So he said to us, he said, well, look, have you got anyone to design it? Or have you got an idea? We said, well, not really. He said, would you leave it to me? Which is exactly what we did. And he donated his work to us. He had done a piece called The Ribbons of Memory at the Stade de France. And we have a smaller version of that here now on the Chemin-des Dames, which we unveiled on the 16th of September 2017.
Wow, that is amazing.
And do you know what? It seems so much more. We think what we were talking about a few weeks ago.
We were talking about the Christmas trees.
Yeah, and the football memorial, which is actually in the wrong place.
Well, the great thing about this, between Frank Viltar and myself, we've actually been able to drive the whole thing through. We've been in control of it as such. So the whole programming of it. I just said to Frank, once we got all the permissions through, it was going to happen. And we started inviting all the various guests and so on, and the teams to come out. We had Trojans from the Southampton area, very famous old club, Waterloo, up there in Lancashire. They came out. We had Cowbridge represent Wales at the festival. The UK Army came out. We had the French Pacific Army here. We had Rugby for Heroes, the French Legends. We had one hell of a weekend commemorating all this. We're then looking, okay, we've got a monument. What do we do next? We've got to give this meaning. Yep. And that's when we came up with the idea of then create or going out to clubs and appealing to clubs and schools, and as I say, the completely utter mixed response. You know, speaking to Stephen about it originally, and Stephen very kindly forwarded to me all the Rosslyn Park details. So we started creating this database, and the idea is that everybody knows about the international players, but no one knows about Fred Jones, the butcher, who played for Old Shrewsbury Thirds on a Saturday afternoon, who got shot to bits on the Somme. So he's as valid as your Edgar Mobbs, your Ronnie Porton Palmers, and etc. So we have a non-discriminate database we're trying to create at the moment from around the world, put together as much detail as we can about the guys who fought and died in World War I. We've now extended that into World War II. And the idea being that we find out where the guy came from, when he was born, who he played for, who he fought with, where he died, when he died. And we just try this basic database, which we want to start opening up a little bit further now by asking families or relatives or people with some knowledge who could put a photograph up of Fred Boggs. And the idea is a research project, and I'm sure, I mean, God willing, that someone will take over the running of this from me at some point on that side of things, because the whole thing is just too big for one or two people just to on their own.
How many guys have you got listed on that at the moment?
We've got around about 5,500 at the moment.
Wow.
Speaking, I mean, I'm sure with Stephen, we both know a lot of people in the game. So a colleague of mine, Steve Berg, who's head of the All Blacks Museum, and I rang Stephen for me the middle of the night, for him lunchtime, and I said, Steve, if you had to put a round figure on it for New Zealand, how many players do you think you've lost in 2 world wars? He said a minimum of 20,000 who played rugby at some level. A basic club level, basically at school, uni, or further up the ladder. You think about stats. I mean, about New Zealand, the guesstimate is not a problem. That's probably not wide of the mark.
Actually, it's very interesting, John, because I hadn't realised that work was being done. I mean, in the second book, which is about, and the first one was purely focused on one club in London, which is Rosslyn Park. But the second book was, went global. So, because I'm not very original on titles, I called it After the Final, because it was about King's Cup in 1919. It enabled me to sort of gallop through, the history of rugby in those nations. But the thing I found myself talking about is that if you look at again, I suppose looking at the stats, about 8 million on the Allied side fought in the war, of which some 10% were fatalities who were killed. If you look at officers, the stat is about 19%. And the reason being is that they were the ones who were most exposed to risk. They were the first over the top. Whatever anybody says, you ignore Blackadder. It's not like that at all. They were the first over. They were the ones who went on the inspection tours, the trench in the middle of the night, and got shot by snipers because they were showing the head above the trenches.
Palmer and Turner, isn't it? A great example.
Yeah, exactly. And then sort of, I was thinking nobody will ever know how many guys who fought were rugby players, because how could you ever know? So apart from the celebrity internationals, nobody would ever know. But when I looked at all the data and particularly the photographs I was collecting, over and over again, I used to see when 15 men got together or 30 men on a field, in any given game, you would find that about 30 to 33 to 35% of the guys in those games prior to the war, whether it was the Oxbridge varsity match, whether it was an international, I mean, the England-France game in 1914, the last international before the war, it was 11 of the 30 who took the field were killed during the war. And he used to get this 30% stat every time. And again, what I put it down, the reason why it's more than the officers is again, this is a hypothesis, it's speculation, is that they were officer class, but also they were rugby players. They were used to leading from the front. So, they would be literally the first over the top, leading the men, and they copped it. And the stories you got, I mean, the Aussie ones at Gallipoli, and so, the guys there, there's a brilliant man called, James, you may know a bloke called Billy Watson, who survived the war. Now, Billy Watson, he captained the Australia team in this 1919 King's Cup. He'd won a military cross by that point, and had come through the most astonishing hardships. He not only did he do this in the First World War, but in the Second World War, he went onto the Kokoda Trail and won a DSO there. So, 20 years later, in fact, more than 20 years later, he was fighting again. But this is the guy who captained, he was a prop forward, I think. He captained this Australian military team that played in the King's Cup. He'd been gassed in October by mustard gas, and it was still in April, bringing up these terrible sores on his legs, which caused him huge pain. And he couldn't play with these. So the team doctor, who had been a medic out in the trenches, used to sort of stick a penknife in some boiling water and then literally sort of lance these sores, these mustard gas sores. So he took the field already bleeding, but it was the only way he could not play in absolutely intense pain, by going on with these sores lanced. And just a phenomenal man. And again, to go on and 25 years later to be fighting in the Second World War. And he survived them both. I mean, so some of these guys are almost superhuman. And his story is just remarkable. So
that's just it. I mean, one of the things we did, Stephen, which you might recall from when we were chatting, I came over to the club with you in 2016, was that part of our appeal around the clubs, because you've got to remember, a lot of clubs have formed. There's a heck of a lot of clubs that have formed pre-war. Some never recovered. There was a huge influx of new clubs from about 1923 onwards through to the mid-30s. Lots and lots of new clubs in that time period. But what we did, I mean, playing for Maidstone as I did after I left the village team, we had an honours board up. Mm. And you've got your past presidents, your captains and secretaries and all that. You've also got the guys who were killed in First World War and Second World War. And part of the appeal out to the clubs and also back to the schools was, you've got these honours board. We're not asking you to dig around and find a huge amount of data that you don't necessarily already not know, but we're just trying to collate it into one place. So there's one place the whole world can come to now, which is the memorial and the database. If you want to find about the history of the game, we're trying to make it, this is the place to come as well. So I've had letters back from some clubs saying, well, why do you want this? Or thank you for inviting us, but we don't feel this is a direction we don't want to go in, or something like that. Whereas others, Clifton is another club, similar age to Ark, Blackheath, London Scottish, these sort of clubs would just fell over themselves to give us what we wanted.
I mean, it's an amazing project what you're doing, and Stephen, the books are amazing. They really sum up the sport. The memorial is done in the rugby spirit. The books are written in the same way. I think only when you've played rugby do you understand what I mean. In a way, through reading books, it's the only way that you're going to actually go, oh, actually, that story is like my grandfather's or my great-grandfather's. And this is really what we want to do.
I can give actually a working example of that. Up in East London, Wanstead Rugby Club, they lost 28 on the Somme in the first Battle of the Somme. Now, they came out for the Somme Centenary Festival, where Stephen very kindly wrote an article for the event programme. And of the kids that came, 3 were direct descendants of the 28. Wow. They were either great-grandsons or nephews of. And what we did on the last morning before they went back, we're really going to take them to Teat Bar, because we knew there was one Wanstead player listed there who was one of the relatives. But we also took them to 2 other grave sites on the Somme and reconnected these kids with their own personal family history. Wow. You can imagine the emotion from that.
Had they been aware, John, before your project?
No. Alistair Fisher, the club historian, knew all this. Yeah. And Alistair was a great guy to work with. But the kids themselves didn't know.
No, I mean, that was to me one of the great eye openers of my project. Is that, one of the things I did is encourage the kids to find out about their own background and the variety. I mean, being Southwest London, very cosmopolitan, people moving in and out. So 2 of my star players at the time with a couple of French boys. One was the number 8, the other one was the scrum half. They were twins, would you believe? One was huge, the other one was tiny. They were twins. But they turn out to have had a father who was a pilot. A great-grandfather who was a pilot. He'd survived the war. The most poignant one, particularly because the parents had not been aware of it, is there was a guy who the origins were German, and they found that the great-grandfather had been on the Eastern Front and had got sort of caught behind the lines by the Russians and was very lucky to escape. And then they left before the Second War, because we all know what was happening in the 30s in Germany, and came to the UK. Effectively became English, but they hadn't realised this. They'd always thought of themselves as English until they looked back at it and realised, and somebody in the family told them the story about their father having fought on the Eastern Front for Germany. And this is a real revelation to them.
So looking forward, obviously, like ourselves, we had lots of plans for 2020 events and tours and so on. Yeah. And you and I and the Trust were going to work together on a couple.
As you know, Chris, I worked for 2 years on preparing the VE75 event in conjunction with the UK military and the Inter-Services Championship. And the idea was that for the 75th anniversary of the end of World War II, we would have this big event in Calais, Dunkirk. But it started in the UK and followed this wonderful path. We tried to keep it revised for this year, but COVID has beaten us twice.
Yeah.
So the idea now is that we're going to have a big restart event in September at the National Arboretum, which we feel is going to be the best place to start. The Inter-Services Committee guys are right behind it. There's a possibility of some very, very special games. At the same time, we're going to have the kids there from local schools.
Fantastic.
As well. So we're going to have this ceremony at the National Arboretum on the 15th of September, of course, which is Battle of Britain Day. 16th of September is World Rugby Memorial Day. And the 18th is the start of the Women's World Cup. So we're actually going to focus on girls rugby as well. We're going to have a girls sevens for novice schools, introducing rugby to schools. Just look at it as a new activity, as well as having a rugby 10s for the boys on September the 15th as well.
We're going to look to now wrap this up, but what I'd like to do is very much, if you're from a rugby club or you played rugby or you have family or you have any link with what we spoke about tonight, do certain things. First of all, and this is going to be a completely blatant plug, get Stephen's book. Stephen, you talked about The Final Whistle, which I have a copy here, and the one after that is called
After the Final Whistle, would you believe?
After the Final Whistle. Get those books, read them, inspire yourself, take it to your rugby club, take it to your team, talk to the senior players, and if they don't help, go into the club, have a look. I mean, obviously, I played at Tunbridge, and I played at boarding school and prep school and so on, but everyone has got a board up. Even modern day, even the local school around the corner has got a board up, and where they were playing football and playing rugby, and get involved, because it is so inspiring. The book's amazing. It is a universal sport on a different way. James, tell me about, obviously in Australia, New Zealand, down under, South Africa, Southern nations. I mean,
it really is huge. And I alluded to it earlier by saying that, sort of back in World War I times, Australia was very much split. It was Australian rules footy, or the footy as it was called back then. And really you only had rugby in New South Wales and a little bit in Queensland, but now it's everywhere. It is absolutely everywhere. It's an Australia-wide competition. And New Zealand, they live, breathe, and eat it for breakfast. I mean, it's just what you do in New Zealand. It's either that or cricket. But it's just part of everyday life. I mean, I grew up, and probably flashing my age here, but I grew up playing Aussie rules, and being from Western Australia, I hadn't really heard of rugby. And I met a New Zealander who said, "You're a big fella," because I've always been a big fella. I'm 6'4" and probably just as wide and a very broad set of shoulders. But he said, "You're a big fella. You should play rugby." And I said, "Well, I've kind of, I don't know. I like my Aussie rules." And he said, "Now come down and try out and see what you think." And I went down and I watched them play a game of union, and I thought, yeah, this is for me. And I played. Didn't play very well, mind you, but I played. And I had a few good years. And then my knees gave out, and then that was that. But, you know, it's a sport unlike any other. You know, you can play football, you can play Aussie rules, you can play basketball, whatever it might be, whatever your sport is. You will never have the camaraderie that you have when you are playing rugby. There is nothing else like it. And I've still got some very good friends from years ago that I still talk to now, and some of my closest friends. So, no, I think, you know, if you're fortunate enough to play rugby and have it in your blood, you will have some friends that you will carry through your entire life. And it's a very special thing.
John, how do guys wanting to get involved in your project get in contact with you?
You can come straight to us at rugbymemorial@gmail.com if you just wanted to email us. We're on Facebook, we're on Twitter. Just go Rugby Memorial, you'll find us there. There's the parent company website, which is www.francourt.org. That's FRANCOURT. The site is currently being updated. You see some of our back videos on there. We've just done new recorded a World in Union with a friend of mine. I'm not singing on it, you'd be pleased to know. Emma is a professional singer, which is great. You'll find our World War II Rugby Heroes video on there. Again, Stephen very kindly nominated a player for that video. Our Remembrance Day video, and we continue now using the YouTube channel within the website now as a marketing tool. Also at the same time to share the history and things that we find. Well, and the Armistice games now held every year is getting bigger each year. Unfortunately, we lost last year because of COVID, but we should be back bigger and stronger. And we're currently about to start a big marketing campaign for kids around Europe to get together in October in Compiègne again.
So I'm going to wrap up now. First of all, I'd just like to say, Stephen, thank you so much. It's been a pleasure. Thank you so much for talking to us tonight.
Yeah, you're welcome. I've enjoyed it.
John, thank you so much. We look forward to working with you and projects and visiting. Desperate want to come down and visit. And I'm going to unfortunately have to drag these two reprobates with me.
Well, we just need the borders to be reopened and I can come over.
Well, gents, a massive thank you.
That's brilliant. Thanks for the invitation, Chris. It's been a pleasure.
You're very welcome. As for who's going to win the Six Nations, predictions, John?
Well, without wanting to upset the natives, I'll just look it up the road just in case. I think after Saturday, England now have to beat France.
Yeah.
Otherwise, I think the French will have enough in the tank this year.
Stephen, any thoughts?
Yeah, France all the way. I mean, clearly the best team there. They should have beaten England the last time round in that sort of autumn tournament. Yep. They've got real talent there. Young team, bravery, trusting people who are in form, which is something Eddie doesn't seem to do. So, no, I mean, France all the way.
James, thoughts?
I'm going to have to go France as well. Oui.
Stephen, any thoughts?
Allez les Bleus.
There we go.
I'm happy because I got my Brexit visa last week.
Brilliant. Guys, it's been an absolute pleasure. So enjoyable tonight. Thank you very much for your time. And we're going to be played out with, there's a song about Christmas trees all together now, but it couldn't more define rugby and the way you play it and where we play it and why we play it. So from us at Shorncliffe Trust, podcast all together now. Thank you very much and thank you for listening.